Hello, and welcome, dear guests. It is with genuine enthusiasm and admiration that I have the privilege of introducing our keynote speaker for today's engaging talk on practitioners' proposals for the improvement of diplomatic practice, Ambassador Androulla Kaminara. Ambassador Kaminara is currently making her mark as our inaugural Distinguished Diplomat-in-Residence at Georgetown University in Qatar for the academic year. Her role is not just a title, it's a testament to her rich experience in shaping international relations and policy. Her presence here represents an extraordinary opportunity for students and the entire community, creating synergies that extend beyond the classroom and into the future of our global society. To name a few recent examples, she has been a dynamic presence in the classroom, collaborating with faculty and enriching courses such as ethics of climate change and gender and economic development. Her contributions have brought real-world examples to life, particularly in how the gender dimension plays a pivotal role in energy policy. In the academic internship course, she offers students invaluable guidance and advice on launching their careers and pursuing fellowships in the realms of diplomacy and its related fields. Breaking glass ceilings has been a recurring theme in Androulla's illustrious career. She was not only the first woman to serve as the first European Union ambassador and head of delegation to the Islamic Republic of Pakistan in the 40 years of bilateral relations, but also the pioneer female director of humanitarian operations for the European Civil Protection and Humanitarian Aid Operations, managing EU's response to crisis across continents from Africa to Asia and Latin America. Her passion for bridging the gap between academia and practice has been evident throughout her career. Heading a task force on knowledge, performance, and results, and as director for quality of operations for Europe Aid, Androulla oversaw the deployment of a substantial EU budget of approximately 10 billion euros, dedicated to enhancing the quality of development cooperation operations in third countries. With a dynamic career oscillating between headquarters in the field, her experiences range from heading the European Commission representation in Cyprus to engaging in academic research as a European Union Fellow at the European Studies Center of St. Antony's College, Oxford University. Before her remarkable journey with the European Commission, Androulla's expertise influenced the highest levels of government as a special advisor to cabinet ministers in Greece, coupled with her leadership as a managing director of a consultancy firm. Educationally, her background is as diverse as her professional endeavors, holding a Bachelor of Science with honors in Geology and Physics from King's College, a Master's of Science in Management Science from Imperial College, University of London, and a Maîtrise in International Politics from the Université Libre de Bruxelles. With this rich and multifaceted tapestry of experience, let us absorb the insights and reflections from a professional who has not only witnessed, but also shaped the evolution of diplomatic practice. Please join me in warmly welcoming a true trailblazer in international diplomacy and public service, Ambassador Androulla Kaminara.
Hello, and let me start by thanking Dr. Shivets for this very enthusiastic introduction. I'd like to thank the Dean for being here this evening, and I'd like to also thank him for the opportunity to be the first diplomat-in-residence in Georgetown, Qatar. This is an opportunity for me and something that I'm thoroughly enjoying already, even though I've been here, let's say, for about a month. And I'd like to thank every single one of you for actually being here and coming to this lecture. I have to start by saying that when I proposed this title, it was early September. And little did I know that the events that we're currently experiencing in the Middle East will basically change diplomacy and change the world, in my view, as we know it, for generations at least to come. I think, and I start by positioning myself, I think diplomacy has failed. We have clearly failed. And it's the time to look back and see what did we do wrong, because we failed, we didn't forecast. If diplomacy is about avoiding conflicts, obviously we've done something seriously wrong. And the current context is also very difficult, both for the diplomacy of practically every country, but also for the US and for, I have to say, for the EU. A note that whatever I say represents my personal views, and I'm now outside the EU, so it does not represent EU policy on any of the topics that I would be talking. So let's go back to get back on the topic, and what I intend to do is to go quickly through the things I wanted to say and allow as much time for Q&A as possible. So. All professions can be improved, and in all modesty, and given the background that I have, I want to propose some areas where improvements can be made or improvements are necessary. My key messages, in a nutshell, is beware of biases, consider the gender aspects, invest in understanding the cultural aspects, engage with all opinion leaders, get out of your comfort zone. You may say these are just common sense, but I think generally where we fail, where we could do much, much better is in exactly those areas. So please bear with me as I go through these and explain what happens. Now, this is a photograph taken from one of the balconies of the UN building in New York. And most people, when they think about diplomacy, they have this vision of some diplomats having a gin and tonic, the drink par excellence for diplomats, in some UN buildings. But diplomacy and the role of diplomats is much more complex than that. So let me talk about what are our biases. Good diplomacy happens when you know your own biases and the potential biases of the other side. Then you can understand more in the interactions between the various parties. There are many cognitive biases and inconsistencies that we all have in our decision making. And often what we decide is rooted in what we value, and therefore it's rooted in our usual social context. It is vital that we scrutinize unhelpful and often incorrect narratives, and experimenting with new narratives must be one of the tools in the toolkit of any diplomat. We must avoid to take for granted commonly accepted narratives. I think quite often where we fail is that we take for granted that a certain narrative, a certain explanation is the explanation or the correct explanation. And the role of a diplomat in a member state, it's exactly to either redefine what is the new narrative, confirm whatever the existing narrative is. And I'll just give you a little example. I remember having a conversation with an Inuit. It's the indigenous people of the Alaska region in Iceland. And he was after a conference, and the person wanted to describe his childhood, saying that he was very poor when he was growing up, so they didn't have cold water in his house. So I kept correcting, no, you mean hot water. And he said, no, cold water, hot water. After a while I said, but why do you insist cold water? If you are poor, you don't have hot water. That was my social background. That's what my background was. And he explained that because they get water from underwater hot springs, the problem for the poor is to have cold water. So this is where do you come from, how much you understand, or what the other person is. Just a small example that illustrates that. So who are the diplomats? You must be aware that most of the diplomats are from privileged classes in their own country. They're rarely from ethnic minorities, and they're predominantly male. Usually they come from a few schools, Georgetown or Ridgeway or Oxbridge or Sciences Po in France. That's important to keep in mind. And who are their counterparts? When you're in a country as a diplomat, who do you talk to? Usually ministers and people in the government who are equally usually from the privileged classes, rarely from ethnic minorities, predominantly male, and usually from the same universities in the host countries. So in those conversations, you have to keep in mind that neither you nor the other side is representing the average person in the street, and therefore be giving a good example of what may be going on in the country. Usually diplomats meet other people in the capital of the country. Again, I was the ambassador in Pakistan, capital Islamabad. Islamabad is not Pakistan. So to understand the country, to get into the details of the country, you have to be out there. And of course you have to be conscious of the biases of the host country vis-à-vis you and your country, or vis-à-vis your characteristics, for example, biases about you being a woman or the wrong color or anything else. I looked and I found a very interesting article which was written by a UK diplomat from Asian background, and he writes, I never had any expectations of becoming an ambassador. His name is Bharat Joshi, and he was the British Deputy High Commissioner in Chennai in India. He says, I never had any expectations of becoming an ambassador, as I didn't go to Oxbridge. He went to Middlesex University, didn't attend private school, was lower middle class, and obviously I was very much the wrong color. So in this diplomatic bubble that you normally live in as a diplomat, you have to be aware of those biases. And the other point I want to make about biases is that we consider that there is one unified position of a country vis-à-vis another country. If you're an ambassador in a country, you represent the position of your own country, or your own, in my case, for example, of the EU, to a third country. But you assume that there is one uniform position, and this is rarely the case. This position depends on whether there's upcoming elections in your whole country, if there's economic crisis, if there are internal factors. Usually you get different ministries or different ministers, or different parts of the government having a different position. So that is one of the difficulties and one of the biases that you have to be aware of. And one of the difficulties as an ambassador is to make sure that you project a uniform position and to address the silos that may exist in the different parts of the government. Second point I want to mention is the gender aspects. I have to say I hesitated to address this because it's so typical that you have a woman diplomat or a woman in any position talking about gender aspects. But I assure you, I would have gladly given the floor if it was a male wanting to talk about this. And I talk about this because taking into consideration gender aspects constitute better diplomatic practice. So, of course, Madeleine Albright, just a few pointers. The American diplomatic service started 110 years ago, but it took 25 years to have the first US female ambassador. She went to Denmark in 1949. It took 65 years to have the first Asian American ambassador, and it took 72 years to have the first Secretary of State. And of course, after Madeleine Albright, there was Clinton and Condoleezza Rice. I have to underline here that a number of the Global South countries have better track records than Western countries, and I would say even better track records of some of the EU countries. And if you look at where women diplomats are, they're usually in the difficult delegations or in the difficult embassies. I remember in the early 2000s where out of 120 embassies in the EU, we had about 4 or 5 women ambassadors. If you talk to people on why is there so few women ambassadors, they would reply to you that women did not want to go to difficult countries. However, if you looked at where are these 5 women, they were in the most difficult countries possible in the world. You know, they were in Zimbabwe, in the Sudans, and the Haitis of this world. So, where they are, it's important. The second thing, I just want you to consider this photograph. It was taken at the signature of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, commonly known as the Iran nuclear deal, in 2015. And of course, the P5 plus 1 are there. The EU is represented by Federica Mogherini, and you don't have to say anything to the Iranians on how important is the role of women if you have a woman negotiating with them on the nuclear deal. So representation, the importance of having women in key roles with key countries. Of course, there's also the issue of the SDGs. I will not go into all of the SDGs. The Sustainable Development Goals were signed in 2015 by all countries. They have to be met by 2030. Currently, we are midterm. This is a slide that underlines where we currently are with respect to gender equality. It's one of the goals that has had one of the biggest impacts of COVID on this. This slide before COVID would have said, for example, that there are 100 years to achieve equal representation between men and women. We're currently at 140. So one of the topics that I think it's in every diplomat's remit is to talk about these goals that have been signed by everybody. The other reason why we should consider the gender aspect is the economy. This is a chart about the Gender Quality Gap Index. I will not go into details again. I just wanted to point out that the area, the region where maximum benefits can be achieved by having higher representation of women is in the MENA region. And to say that in countries like Pakistan, that's where I was, there would be a 20% increase in GDP per capita if women were not more integrated into the economy. So there is an economic reason, apart from any rights-based reason why you should be including women. The third point I want to raise is about understanding more the cultural aspects, and I will just give 3 very, very quick examples from 3 different countries. Cultural aspects, in my view, are not enough is being done in this area in the context of diplomatic practice. If possible, I would propose that anthropologists are recruited and employed much more in the context of embassies or delegations throughout the world. A first quick example on Pakistan. There was a lot of discussion about the role and the relationship between the Pashtuns, which are basically an ethnic group which basically exists on both sides of the Afghan-Pakistan border. And there was, of course, a lot of cooperation, which according to the Western narrative, a lot of this cooperation was due to the fact that, let's say, the Pakistani Pashtuns were in agreement with sort of Taliban ideology. One issue that was greatly missed was the cultural aspects of being a Pashtun. And being a Pashtun, any Pashtun will tell you that they have to adhere to 3-4 different principles. One of them being offering hospitality and asylum to all guests. So I'm not saying that there was no ideological connection between the two sides, but the actual cultural aspect of being a Pashtun was very, very important on how you looked at that particular equation. The second example I want to discuss is about Afghanistan. This photograph is it's a photograph I took of 2 Afghan women with which, in an hour that I spent in the room that they were sitting on the floor, basically because there was nothing else to sit on, I got more understanding about the Afghan situation than any reading or any analysis that I had read before. And these 2 were illiterate to the extent that they couldn't even tell me their age. Another interesting thing to note about this photograph, of course, when we were talking woman to woman, they took off the burqa. At the end, I just wanted a photograph of them, and they put the thing, and they stood upright. They posed for the photograph, and this is the photograph. So, of course, the issue of culture and what does it mean to be in Afghanistan is very, very important. I want to refer to a book by a fantastic and very brave journalist, Canadian journalist. Her name is Kathy Gannon, and the book is called I for Infidel. Now, Kathy refers somewhere in the book about the UN representative that was at the 1996-97 in Afghanistan, trying to get a brokered agreement between the Taliban and the Mujahideen government. And his name was Norbert Hall. He was a German diplomat. And in one of the conferences, she says that she asked him, how are you dealing with gender aspects? And are you raising that during the negotiations? And she quotes him as saying, women, don't talk to me about women. I don't mention women. That's a cultural issue. I'm trying to negotiate peace here. I looked up what he was sending to the UN at the same time, because there's all these UN reports, and he was saying that his report to the Security Council was saying that the issue of women's and girls' rights remains a priority for the UN. But I raise this because a lot of the things are being put on cultural issues, and at that time there was no prehistory of not allowing women to work in Afghanistan or not allowing them to go to education. And unfortunately, again, in a lot of the situations I have seen that lack of understanding for cultural issues causes us to accept different narratives, and then leads to, in my view, wrong decisions. Final example on Nigeria. This is something from August 2016. At that time, and I was wearing my humanitarian hat, in Lake Chad, which is between 3 countries, Chad, Niger, and Nigeria, there was a huge increase in Boko Haram fighters. Now, everybody was very concerned as to why there were so many young people joining Boko Haram. And there was this narrative now, the ideology is being accepted by so many young people, this is going to explode and things like this. When you go on the ground, basically, and talk to people, you find out that most of the recruits, the young recruits, were joining Boko Haram for some basic reasons. Boko Haram would offer them a GSM, a mobile phone, and that was a big deal for them. And because in order to get married, you needed to be rich, Boko Haram would ensure that they would provide wives to these recruits. And that stage, I don't know if any of you remember this case of the Chibok girls, which was a situation where something like 300 school students, girls, were abducted, and they were abducted in order to provide them as women to these fighters. Again, misunderstanding of the situation on the ground and what are the political aspects. Which brings me to the fourth topic I want to talk about: engage with all opinion leaders. I believe that in the practice of diplomacy, there is a tendency not to talk enough with who are the people following. It could be musicians, it could be activists, and it could be, in some cases, religious leaders. 84% of the world's population say that they are religious. And in certain countries, in certain contexts, they are the most influential people, particularly in rural areas where state institutions are not visible. Who they listen to tends to be the religious leader. This is not considered part of the diplomatic remit normally. And I have to say, when I arrived in Pakistan, it was not on my radar screen at all to be in contact with religious leaders. But how, and I will explain what this shows, how I got to that was that it was clear to me that if we wanted to influence ideas on the ground, a Western person, man or woman, going and say, well, you have to consider this, or, respect other people's religions, or harmony between the different ethnic groups would not make it. The only people that they would listen to is their religious leaders. And then that started a very enriching in the end, but sort of a dark path in the beginning, engagement with religious leaders, which led to an intra-religious workshop where religious leaders of all faiths in Pakistan, plus NGO representatives, were sat at the table and actually agreed on a declaration that each person around the room had to preach in their own constituency. So there was the Christians, there was the Muslims of various denominations, Hindu, but also the NGOs will have to talk. And that, in my view, shows the need to be flexible and to be out of your comfort zone when you are in a country, because each country requires different approach. And before I started this, because we have this network of ambassadors, I would have advised not to go anywhere near religion, because this can be highly explosive, and it could have been. But in the end, it was worthwhile. So to tell people that talk to anybody who has a voice and is listened to by others. So in conclusion, be aware of biases, consider the gender aspects, invest more in understanding the cultural aspects. I couldn't underline that more. Get out, talk to as many people, visit the regions, and to have your own idea about what is happening. And of course, avoid silos. And for those students that are here that aspire to be diplomats, enjoy the journey. I'll leave it at that. Thank you for listening, and I'll gladly answer any questions or hear any comments that you may have on this. Thank you. I think we have to. Christine, would you join me for the question and answer, please?
Good evening. Thank you very much for your very illuminating talk. So I just had two questions. So when we say diplomatic, we usually understand a person who can control a difficult situation without upsetting anyone. And I'm just curious to know, what is your definition of being diplomatic? And my second question is, with recent events, many of my friends, many of my peers are kind of losing their hope in the power of diplomacy, international organizations, including but not limited to UN and others. And do you think, what would you say to them? And if there is still hope, where and what it is? Thank you.
So thank you for the question. Of course, as a diplomat, you shouldn't upset anybody. But there is this notion which I resisted in my career. There's this notion that you should never say directly anything because, you know, this is what diplomats do. They never get to the point. I believe that by being sincere and also showing your humanity, showing your personality, which sometimes may mean that you do say things directly, then you're potentially appreciated more, and then you can do more other things because the others know where the limits are or where the things are. So the objective is to engage with others, to be trusted by others, and for others to know where you are, rather than having this phase of, you know, the diplomat that doesn't show emotion, the diplomat that, you know, it's behind the mask. And therefore I lean towards the diplomat that it's a human being that shows who they are, and that therefore can be trusted more by the other side. Nobody wants to talk to a mask. Nobody wants to talk to somebody that doesn't directly answer, you know, when they ask questions. That has been my my path, and that has been a path that, in my view, produced results. Now, about losing hope, I started by saying that we have failed, diplomacy have failed for us to be in this type of situation right now. However, first, we cannot afford to lose hope, first. Secondly, if we fail up until now, that means we have to put a lot more effort and a lot more energy and a lot more intelligence and humanity into what we do. The UN, yes, you could say that the UN could have done a lot more, and that's certainly true. However, that's what we have. That's the best tool set we have that can respond to this situation. And of course, there's been for many years, I would say decades, this attempt for the reform of the UN system, you know, Security Council, and all of these things. Progress has been made, not enough and not fast enough. But that's the best bet we have. So it's about greatly increasing our efforts in that way. And I think, although in the beginning of the crisis, let's say, the UN was not as strong as it has come out in the last week. I think that's important also to underline. I think what Secretary General Guterres has done over the last week has really put the UN back on the track of that's the way we should be going. Thank you.
Do we have more questions?
Hello. Ambassador Kaminara, great to see you again. Gert
Hello.
Norman, Professor of International Relations here. In fact, I just came from a class about the United Nations system where this kind of sense of despair was palpable, and so that your answer would be a useful partial counterweight, should we say. But I wonder, on this case of the failure of international politics rather than diplomacy, perhaps, isn't it, with all the best diplomats in the world, with all the best ambassadors and anthropologically informed staffing of embassies, ultimately counted for nothing at all, because the decisions were made by an Israeli government of a particular hue, and then the reaction was ultimately determined by the United States, by politics. So the heavy hand of central politics completely obliterating any efforts that diplomats might be able to make, or indeed whether at the UN or at national country embassies. And of course one sees this reflected in the apparently pretty huge resentment among professional State Department diplomats against what's been going on, but they have absolutely no grip on what's happening. So there is that specific example, but the broader question, I suppose, is how do professional diplomats deal with the fact that sometimes they have no grip at all on who actually and what actually determines what happens, which is decided by a few politicians looking at their domestic audiences in state capitals?
Very, very interesting and tough question. Thank you for that. Okay, what were the failures? The first, in my view, failure was the failure to forecast what happened on 7th of October. Every country, every institution has these forward thinking, cells that try to forecast what is possible to happen and not happen and all. So everybody was stating that this came out of the blue. So obviously there was a huge failure there. In my talk, I also talked about that you should know your biases. And you should also know that at any particular point in time, what is decided is also influenced by, if there's elections, not elections, political things, which is basically what you're saying, or which, in some cases, which ministry or which part of the state apparatus of the government has the upper hand. In some situations, you may have, the trade part of the government being stronger, and then you have decisions promoting trade but not helping in other ways, or vice versa. So this is part of the, of the game. But although I despair also, I started by saying diplomacy has failed, and I despair as well by the fact that we were not able, and we're not able to do more. It's the best. I really believe that the UN, it's the best tools we have. If somebody started from scratch, let's say there was no UN today, and tried to put in place international humanitarian law, international laws on what should happen, I believe because of the current context, we'll probably end up with something much worse, more watered down versions of what the UN is supposed to be doing than what was decided 60 years ago, or 60 or 70 years ago. So we don't have the right tools, but it's the best tools we have right now. The other thing is that, of course, certain politicians can influence decisions. I don't want to point specific countries, but let's say countries that have upcoming elections may vote differently than others which, you know, have a more stable government and therefore are not afraid of the public opinion. But I think what we've seen with respect to the Gaza war, the massive mobilization of people has also influenced, to a large extent, what politicians vote. And a lot have changed their position because they want to be re-elected. So it's not one thing that makes the change, but it's a series of things at the same time happening and hopefully working in the same direction. From what I know, but I only just briefly saw a headline, Netanyahu yesterday announced that he after the war is over, he wants to take control of Gaza. And from what I saw in the headlines, I think the US has said that they don't agree with this. So this is also a change that, let's say, 2 weeks ago, we would not have seen such a difference of opinion between the two. So.
So thinking a little bit about the points the takeaways that you gave us and moving diplomacy forward and the tools and the humanity and the value of this relationship building, where you say get out of your comfort zone. How do you decide when you're going in to get out of your comfort zone and you're engaging with these opinion leaders, what approach is best?
There is no rule book, or at least I didn't, if it exists, I didn't get one, that says, you know, in this situation, that. In some cases, you just have to take risks. You have to take risk, you try, you have to feel comfortable with potentially certain things failing, and you move on. I mean, the conference that I showed on the religious leaders was an interesting learning school for me, because first of all, let me explain that if you are the EU ambassador in a country, then one of your responsibilities is also to chair the meeting of the bilateral ambassadors in that country. So, for example, in Pakistan, there was an EU embassy, but also there were 17 member states that had bilateral embassies in that country. And one of the roles of the EU ambassador is to chair that. So when I embarked on this, my colleagues were interested, but let's say more risk averse than I was. And I also discussed with the other key embassies that we had in Islamabad, you know, US, Canada, and other countries, that this is what I wanted to do. And in order to minimize the potential explosiveness of this, if you went the wrong way, we had arranged that all the ambassadors that were going to come and, let's say, react to the results of this meeting would be available, but would not leave and come to the meeting until there was a WhatsApp message saying, things are going well, please come. So you try and minimize the potential problems. You risk other things like talking to, was a very popular pop singer there that when COVID struck, we needed to pass the message to wear masks and for people. And then I didn't know the person, I didn't know how it would be, but let's try. And that's where the come out of your comfort zone comes. Because if you can sit and say, well, I haven't tried this, I haven't tried the other, at the end you have to try some things and be comfortable and minimize whatever negative cost if it fails. And that's how, at least that's how I approach this. I'm sure other people have other ways of dealing with it.
Thank you for the talk, Doctor. A question of gender. In your opinion, despite the paucity of professional women diplomats in the realm of diplomacy, which gender, men or women, in general and on the whole, can influence the recipients, the country, the population, of her or his values, the self-values and the values of the organizations, the countries that they represent?
Again, I was saying about each person's biases. You have to be aware of your own biases. You can't change a country just because you're male or female or because you have any other characteristic that may be important. But for example, that a female diplomat was accepted at a table where, let's go back to the religious leaders, that the religious leaders were there, does pass the message that, you know, women are potentially equal, or at least certain women we can accept. That's why I put up the photograph of Federica Mogherini on the Iran deal. She was the High Representative, it's not politically correct, but anyway, the representative on foreign policy of the EU. Having her discussing with the Iranians on such an important topic, I think passes other messages apart from the actual topic, which was the Iran deal. And I don't want to say every woman is, you know, has these characteristics, or every man has these characteristics. I think when I talk about gender is to talk about using all the characteristics that men and women may have in order to promote what you want to promote. Because it's not like every woman is the same or every man is the same. But to enlarge the pool of talent in what you want to do in a particular country by considering not just the men, but also the women. I hope I've answered your question.
Just to follow up a little bit on the question asked, it reminds me of when you were speaking about misunderstandings that can happen on the ground. And so if men and women and the impact or influence that they might have, do you have an example of maybe where this perhaps within these cultural aspects led to a misunderstanding on the ground?
One of the controversial topics in Pakistan, and something that was taken up repeatedly by members of the European Parliament, was the issue of forced conversions. Forced conversions of predominantly Christian girls that would be stolen or married off to, usually at quite a young age, to Muslim male men. And this was something that was repeatedly coming up, and there were movements against this. Of course, as a person, any forced marriage, and as an EU policy, any forced marriage is against EU values. However, and the idea was that they were targeting just Christian girls. When we started to look into more details about the problem, we realized that the forced conversions were not just targeting other religious groups, but they were targeting some religious groups, and some religious groups which were very poor. So traditionally, there's about 3%, I think 3-4% Christians in Pakistan. They tend to be from the poorest of the poor in the country and least educated. So you didn't have forced conversions of Zoroastrians or other groups which tended to be economically much richer, more educated, and of course if something went wrong, they could have defense. So, and after talking also to representatives of these religious groups, it was quite clear that the conversions would not normally happen when the girl was married, but later in the relationship. And what happened would, it would be that there was the marriage, and because under Muslim law you could marry a Christian, but when the girl would go into a family and go into the nucleus of that family, usually the mother-in-law, would insist that she converts, and quite often it was in her own, with her own will that she converted, because that made her life easier. So you have a narrative that you have these forced conversions. Of course they were happening, but the explanation behind it is much more complex than what was originally thought of to be the case.
Ambassador, thank you for the lovely talk, and my appreciation for the incredible work that you've done and for the Peace Award that you won earlier on.
Thank you.
My background is that I'm a veteran from the Indian Navy. I've done my bit of stint in diplomacy while I was there.
Can you hold the microphone a bit further away, because
right. My background is that I'm a veteran from the Indian Navy, and I've done my diplomatic stint while I was there. In such positions, it's always helpful when we get a clear party line from the superiors that in which direction are we trying to take that diplomatic effort which we are engaging in. At times it happens that while you've put a lot of effort into this kind of diplomacy and building towards a goal that you're working at, suddenly geopolitics causes things to change, the leadership changes, priorities change, and you leave your stakeholders you're engaging with in a very vulnerable position. One recent example was the US withdrawal from Afghanistan and the debacle which happened after that. So while it's nice in diplomatic circles to talk about successes, there are failures that a diplomat encounters too. So would you like to share one such example that you've been through, and how does a diplomat cope with that and come out in a relatively better situation than a disaster?
Okay. Of course there are diplomatic failures, and of course what you do is in the context of the time. Even if you do the right thing, which is not always the case, you know, we're human beings, we can make mistakes. But even if you do the right thing, situation changes on the ground, and what you were, the good intentions you might have had, or the good intentions of your government, may also backfire. I mean, you mentioned Afghanistan. The EU and others have put trillions into helping the country stand on its own feet, into development cooperation. I mean, if you divide how much money has gone into Afghanistan and how much is the population, they should all be millionaires by now. You know, however, things happen and the context changes. You make mistakes, because I was talking about the biases, because you make mistakes because you don't understand enough the situation on the ground, and things do backfire. I remember at some stage there was a huge effort, also lots of money being put into, again, in Afghanistan, about having elections. And this was considered that, you know, we have to have elections, and there will be a democratically elected government, because that's what we promote. We promote democracy. and then things would get much, much better. However, at that time, the government was only controlling about 40% of the terrain in Afghanistan. So, first of all, elections in a country where you cannot make sure that everybody votes, that's one question. Second question was how quick, I mean, the results came out, I think, a year and a half later, because of course there were issues about who, if they were correctly counted and all these types of things. And in the end, I think 5%, 8% of the population voted. So obviously, I mean, the intentions were absolutely great, that we give Afghans the possibility to vote their own government, and therefore, because that's what we knew, that was, let's say, in our biases. That's how you build a state. But on hindsight, which is of course 2020, it was not the thing that Afghanistan needed at the time. So those types of examples, there's a lot of those exist. I'm sure, you know, as somebody looking back on my career, I've obviously made mistakes as well. However, the important thing is when mistakes are made in whatever context, that at least the intentions were good, and to learn what didn't work there. If the next Afghanistan, I hope there is a next Afghanistan, comes along, don't go into this issue of doing elections when the situation is not ripe for that.
Much for giving the talk. It was the first time that I actually got a chance to listen to somebody who works within international organization and represents and is an ambassador of the EU. So my question is actually precisely about that. I was wondering what is the difference of being an ambassador of a specific country compared to being an ambassador of an international organization. And the reason I'm asking this question is I'm wondering whether there have been dilemmas you have faced when European Union didn't have an agreement within countries on a specific policy issue. So let's say 15 countries were in favor of some policy, whereas 10 countries were in disfavor. So in this case, what decision-making power does an ambassador have to sort of navigate and include their personal position on the EU matters? Thank you.
Thank you for that. Well, working for the EU means that you have to take on board the position of 27 member states, which normally is defined back in Brussels within the by the High Representative, the Vice President of the European Commission. Right now it's Monsieur Borrell. And within the context of the European Council, where you have the heads of state of the 27 countries coming together. So there's a lot more meetings and a lot more negotiations that take place in defining anything if you're representing an EU member state than the EU than a member state. Common positions or a position from a country is much easier to produce, although it's tough in itself, but it's much easier if you compare with an international organization. However, if you're looking at, let's say, decisions of the EU, they tend to have a 360-degree approach to a particular problem because of the difference of sizes of the EU member states, the difference of the political backgrounds of the EU member states. So if they do take a position, in my view, it tends to be a much more deeply analyzed and much more holistic type of decision. And this is the same for any, I mean, each international organization has its own stakeholders, so it's not member states, but it would have to implement things according to a common position of all its stakeholders. As a diplomat, you cannot take decisions on your own. However, you can use constructively any ambiguity that may exist in any decision that is taken. So if the particular decision is not crystal clear, that it's in the gray zone, you could apply it in a particular situation in the best way fitting the relationships with that country. So, and constructive ambiguity is often something that exists in a lot of these common positions in international organizations. In fact, recently when there was the vote, going back to the Gaza issue, when there was the vote in the General Assembly about Gaza, there were certain member states that abstained, certain member states supported the resolution, and certain member states voted against. So that's how complex it can be for different reasons. So
I just want to go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Doctor, for discussing about many diplomatic and different examples from the different countries. My name is Muhammad. I'm from Pakistan. So thank you for that. You have
Pakistan?
Yeah, I'm from
Okay.
Pakistan, and because you
Assalamu
have
alaikum.
discussed too many examples from Pakistan, so I completely agree with that context that later conversions of the religions later in the relationship of the ladies, that when they are marrying with some Muslim country, a Muslim person, and they are living in their houses, and then to completely safe and to have a prosperity and to have a greater future, they are forcefully, or you can say that they are prefer to convert. But my question is related to Palestine and Gaza. My question is two ways. That after 75 years of oppression and occupation, what will be the proper, we have been listening a term in the Western media and international media these days, that the proportionate response. So what should be the proportionate response of the Palestinians after the 75 years of occupation? And the two-way question is like that, what should be the proportionate response of the Palestinians now after the 10,000 deaths, casualties, and then 4,000 of children deaths? What should be the diplomatic proportionate response of the Muslim Brotherhood or the international community that after this much of the casualties and the regulations what has been denied by the international communities and all that thing? Thank you.
thank you. But the issue, I was actually in this room yesterday, and I listened to a professor Professor Said, who is the expert on the issue of international law, particularly on proportionality. So I don't feel that I have the expertise to reply to you on proportionality. There isn't a measurement, at least I don't have it. I don't have the answer that would say so many it's okay and over that amount it's not okay. I can reply to that as somebody who worked on many humanitarian crises. Let's just pick one. The thing showed about Nigeria and Maiduguri during the Boko Haram area. You cannot believe how complex it is to be able to provide basic services to even 1,000 people turning up in an area overnight. And that was what was happening in Maiduguri at the time. We would go one day and there would be a field, and the next day there would be a couple of thousand people arriving, which need somewhere to sleep, something to eat, they need water, they need basic latrines and basic protection, because you have women arriving with young children, and it's just total chaos. I cannot fathom what it would take to actually help so many Palestinians moving in such a short period of time with no health services, no water, and no NGOs on the ground. Usually when there is a humanitarian crisis, you have the UN agencies, the international NGOs, you have the UNICEFs, the UNHCRs of this world, Médecins Sans Frontières, the Save the Children, all of these types of organizations which set up their operations very, very quickly and provide those services to the people. And even in large movements of people, it can take several weeks. What we're seeing now is that no provision there's no NGOs on the ground, there's no provision of things on the ground. So when they say catastrophic, I don't know what word can be used to more than catastrophic, but catastrophic doesn't sound tragic enough to represent what potentially could be happening on the ground. So, and just a comment, I think there was another question about the rules and the UN system. I remember a few years back, there was a lot of debate in Geneva about the necessity to change international humanitarian law, to enhance international humanitarian law in order to include advances of technology. For example, according to international humanitarian law, if you bomb an ambulance or a hospital and people die, this is against international humanitarian law. However, if you cut off the internet, which causes people to die in that hospital, it's not addressed. And all the humanitarians, all the people that were working on the ground said, well, look, the world has moved. We need to change this set of rules, and we need to change them and update them to reflect the reality on the ground, that a lot more of these attacks actually involve attacking the infrastructure, attacking the networks that exist. And every time, and these are people that are dedicated 1,000% humanitarian, every time the conclusion was that if we open this Pandora's box, maybe, if you had the needle of international humanitarian law being here and we wanted to push it there, maybe the result would be that to have it back here. You probably end up, because of the context, of the global context, you probably end up having more flexible international humanitarian law than what was needed, and we didn't touch it.
So I'm struck by also going back to the slide that you showed on the Sustainable Development Goals, since we are moving towards the end of our time slowly. But considering all the gender aspects and thinking back of that slide that you showed, and the improvement of diplomatic practice that we may need, since we seem to be halfway to the 2030 goals, what are some, tips or tools that you might have, or recommendations? What do you see moving forward in foreign policy now as we're moving forward within those tools that we may use?
About gender and being aware that basically we went backwards recently. We moved further away from the objective than before. Before COVID, it would have taken 100 years, or one of the indicators. Now it's going to take 140 years. At the current pace, there's only one way to get to where we want faster, is to change the pace, to move into another gear, to be able to be more forefront, to put minimum representation goals, like if we're talking about the point that I was making about 140 years, On the same slide, there is a statistic, and I will find it, about women in parliament, equal representation of women and men in parliament. And it says that in countries where there are quotas, 30% of the representatives in parliament are women. Where there are no quotas is 21%. Of course, there's a whole philosophy behind, do we want quotas or don't we want quotas? But having quotas obviously makes a difference in the figures. So moving into a situation where business as usual is no longer sufficient. Business as usual would not get us to where we want to be. So change it, drastically change it, and take decisions to make those changes. Again, if not for reasons of rights, do it for economic reasons. As I try to indicate at least, and try to highlight, if you want to increase GDP in most countries, you need to include a higher percentage of women in the workforce. Now that does not just benefit the women, it benefits the men in that country as well. So let's talk economics. Let's talk economics, put some specific targets and try and meet them.
I was particularly struck from the question by the student in terms of the 27 member states and the 360-degree approach we're talking about. So is that having that change and making these changes, is that also the larger view of the EU in applying these to the quotas or to
actually, yes, certain things, and that's where also where the UN comes in. I have found that certain things may be easier to agree on when you have more people around the table, in the sense that people would agree on principles more easily if there's lots of people around the table, rather than individual countries. And vis-a-vis the EU about gender aspects, not every member state looks at gender aspects with the same, through the same prism. But having to decide as a group raises the bar. Whereas if there was one member state to decide on its own, maybe for cultural reasons, for historical reasons, the bar would be lower. Because you have this group that is trying to move forward together, there is a tendency, there is an inertia to move faster. So, so that there is, it's not just more complicated, but in certain issues, it can move the bar higher, and because everybody wants to be part of that group, and everybody wants to be a good player in that group. If we want to say it that way.
I like that view.
Is somebody there?
Yes.
May I have a question?
Yes.
So, thank you for your speech for today. And I have two questions. First is like, how did you success in this main dominating area, especially in foreign service? And how did you get the say in this field? And the second question is, how can the future females to work on to also be very powerful and influential in ambassadors and diplomacy? And what, yes, do you have any tips for students like me who will graduate from Georgetown University in Qatar? Yes, that's my questions.
I'm sorry, the second question is, do I have any suggestions for students graduating?
For female students.
For female students, okay.
Thank you.
If you are the minority for whatever reason in any group of people, I think by definition, in order to survive, you have to make sure that you contribute more than the average. Or what? You know, it could be blonde people in a group and you're the only dark person in the group or whatever. If you are a minority, in order to be accepted, in order to be seen as a credible person around that table, I think you have to make sure that you contribute not at the average, but above the average. I don't know if I've succeeded, but I always try to know the topic, to have gone into the details and things like this, which may be a pressure that my male colleagues would not have had, would not have felt to the same degree. Being stubborn helps, certainly helps. So for what advice for female students? Never accept anybody telling you that you shouldn't be there, that you shouldn't be at the table. This day and age, you should be at the table if you know what you're talking about. So if people don't feel comfortable with you being at the table, that's their problem, not yours. That's how I've looked at the thing all along. So be determined, network, and network between females. One of the things I keep saying, but I think we're still struggling with it, is that let's say in any profession there could be 15-20% women. I think globally now there's about 20% women diplomats. And there is a tendency between the women to fight to be in that 20%, rather than the women fighting that 20% becomes 50% or 30%. So network between the women and but fundamentally, be good at what you do and be determined, and don't let anybody clip your wings just because you're a woman or the wrong color or the wrong nationality or whatever it may be. That's my advice. Thank you.
Good evening. Thank you for the talk. One of the things which you mentioned during your speech was that the Global South has a better track record in terms of personnel in diplomatic cadre. My question is there any particular structural factors which is the reason for Global North to be so? Because if I say I am from India, now as soon as India got independence, it was a surprise when India actually appointed high commissioners to countries, even permanent representatives to the UN. Most of them were women. And even if I talk about South Asian nations, this is not to say that they have a good track record in terms of women empowerment. They don't. But still, they still have appointed women to much of their positions. In case of India, it's a common exam which is common for everybody. And even if you're talking about political leaders in these parts of the world, there's been women representatives even at as heads of government. Even if you talk about Pakistan, India, Sri Lanka, all of these nations. So just wanted that gender aspect from you. Thank you.
Let me give you an example. When the African Union was created, which was created several decades after the European Union was created, when the African Union was created, in its treaty it said half the commissioners would be women. And from the first set of commissioners that came in, there were women. The European Union has, for the first time, been able to have equal number of men and women commissioners during the term of Ursula von der Leyen, which was the current president of the European Commission, who was the first woman president of the European Commission, and equal number of male and female commissioners. So I give that example to say how much certain other regional groupings have been well ahead of, let's say, groupings of countries like the European Union, which we consider, if you are in the European Union, you consider you're well ahead of on all these topics, and you're very interested in the gender aspects and things like this. And we, as the European Union, has been producing legislation about equal opportunities in the member states for decades, but we were only able to do it, let's say, 3 or 4 years ago. So that there is an example. You have countries like, I think Rwanda has more female ambassadors and more female ministers than male, because they decided that that's what they were going to do. With respect to heads of state, female, you mentioned India and Pakistan, of course. Of course, there were, and they are still ahead of certain member states because they've had a head of state female. But I don't think that you achieve the ultimate goal by just having one female in the history of a country. It's a lot more advanced than certain others, but at the end of the day, you're talking about using the best talent for the best job all the way up the hierarchy. And potentially the token women that, for various reasons, managed either to be a head of state, I don't think is enough. But it certainly is a reference point, I think, also both in India and certainly in Pakistan, that you had Benazir Bhutto, for example, as a head of state. Something changes in that country when you have that in the history of the country.
In the interest of time, I think we have time for one more question.
Good evening.
Good evening.
My name is Yeda. I am a fresh alumni from Georgetown University in Qatar. I studied international politics, and I come from a small country in the Balkans called Albania, where in the past few years we've been trying to make a lot of progress in terms of representation. Almost half of our governmental cabinet is composed of women, which seen as a news headline would sound as an amazing thing, because you'd think that we have representation. However, in the case of my own country, I've come to understand in practical terms the difference between representation, having a seat at the table, and having authority, being able to have a say in the decision-making and policy-making process. And so as a young scholar, as a student of politics, as a researcher, as a woman, and as a citizen of my country, I cannot help but think of possible ways through which I can help to change this status quo in a country where in the outside things are marketed as the most progressive, but in reality there's a lot of barriers that we as women have to break. And considering your extensive experience, it would be wonderful to hear your perspective. Thank you.
Yes. First of all, like the example I raised about, the talk about the issue of women in Afghanistan, and don't talk to me about women, which is the UN representative saying that's a cultural issue. I deal with peace, and therefore from this type of mentality, that what is the politically correct thing to say, right in the report that of course we're interested in gender equality, but what is the bias of the people that are representing those UN values or EU values? There is a big difference. And having been the first woman in a number of posts in, let's say, around being the only woman around the table. Of course, you can make a change. It's easier for others to come to the table. But there are studies that say unless there is a minimum of about 30% representation of whatever the minority be, it could be women and men, it could be, I don't know, whites and black, or any type of characteristic that makes you different from the majority. Once you get over 30%, then there is a much more accelerated impact of having somebody from a minority or an ethnic group or whatever it may be. That's one of the things I would say. So making that small, let's say, slice of the pie bigger, at least getting it to 30% would change a lot of the things. Quite often, of course, there is the token woman which says, we've ticked the box, you know. It's an afterthought. Oh, there's no women on the panel. Let's get a woman on the panel because it looks bad. Get a woman that doesn't say anything at the end, or we don't give her the floor, or when she tries to speak in the meeting, she's cut off and nobody's listening to her. You know, these types of things are happening, have been happening, I've experienced personally. So, and that's where also networking with other women, which I think, again, I don't want to get into the stereotypes, but I think men tend to be much more skillful in networking with other men than women for various reasons, because potentially a woman is doing a lot more than a man because she's usually also dealing with family and things like this, so she has to leave earlier. But networking with other women is also a very important thing. Coaching, I mean, coaching people that are following you. You know, you're a scholar, you know, somebody starting, coaching those women helps, because that's what happens in the other part. That's what happens in the, between the men. So there's no easy answer, but trying to get out of the corner collectively is probably the way to do it. And having data. Being able to document that there is discrimination, whatever the either gender discrimination or color discrimination, being able to document gets people to listen. If you can't prove it, they say, okay, this person is talking about blacks are discriminated because he's black or she's black, you understand? Whereas if you can prove that, look, black people applying or women applying get less opportunities than the men, then you can try and do something about it.
Thank you all for joining us this evening, and Ambassador Kaminara, a heartfelt thank you for rich and engaging discussion and insights. Thank you.
Thank you very much for